Okay, welcome everyone. Today's session is about breach response unfiltered, what actually works when the worst happens. Every CISO I know has a plan, has an incident response plan, has playbooks, has tools, has roles assigned. But if we're honest, the Mike Tyson quote is always comes to be true. No plan survives first punch in the face, and that's kind of the way a lot of times a real incident feels. And what I've seen through my career, 20 years in data breach litigation, privacy law, lived many incidents, and often decisions are getting made in Slack threads. Ownership gets very blurry. Leadership often wants to know answers that are hard to have answers to when you're going through an incident. And I think more often than not, the failure isn't really a technical one. It's more about the organizational approaches. So got two amazing panelists here, Joe Sullivan and James Beeson, very experienced CISOs, have been through many incidents, many scars over the years to bring to bear here. And so just going to dig right in. So Joe, you've seen obviously some of the most high profile incidents in the world, both from the inside, but also I know many CISOs call you when they're going through some tough things. When things go wrong, what does it actually feel like in that first 24 hours?
Well, the thing to remember is that we train our teams to treat every incident like it's the most important incident. So oftentimes when an incident response gets spun up, you don't know how serious the situation is. And one thing I think anybody who's been through a bunch of these realizes is that your understanding of the facts on the ground is constantly evolving during those first day or two. It's a matter of, you want your team to assume the worst, the security team that is. You want the security team to assume the worst, be kind of like checking down every rat hole, exploring every angle, making sure everything's okay. And so the team comes at it from this protective approach. Like, we got to make sure we get to the bottom of this as fast as possible. And so there's a self-imposed stress. You almost automatically treat every situation like it's the worst case scenario until proven otherwise. And so you're just coming at it with that stress from the start that maybe the rest of the company finds a little intense.
Yeah. What is it like, when that the moment when things go from, okay, it's not a drill. This is not something that we've been able to dismiss. This is real. What can you describe a little bit what that moment feels like and what its kind of impact is to you and your team?
Yeah, it's. I think there's two types of reactions. Some people have like that look like their heart is sinking, like oh crap moment. Whereas people who've been through incidents before, people who choose to go into the incident response profession, it's their time to shine. They get energy from these situations. They're the kind of people who want to be in those crisis situations, and they get calm and focused. So I've seen that as a leader overseeing teams handling incidents, I've got to be on the lookout for both kind of reactions, and I as a leader have to be there to help calm the people who are getting their heart in their throat, and I got to recognize who I can lean on, who's getting focused.
What would you say has surprised you most about how the organization more broadly reacts in those situations?
Yeah, it's I think there, in the same way that I described those two different types of reactions, there's two different types of organizations. There's the organization that understands that incidents are going to happen, that we're going to get alerts that might be false alarms, that we're going to assume the worst until proven otherwise. And so those organizations treat these incidents as a matter of a course of business. It's an expected thing. We have to go through this. It's a process. We're trained for it. We have the tools, and we're going to execute. And then other organizations, they panic. They get really anxious. If they've never exercised these muscles, they don't feel comfortable. And again, having been through many incidents, I've seen organizations that kind of handle it both ways.
Yeah. James, you've led security inside some of the largest organizations in the world. What is the difference between what it's like to manage from the inside of a Fortune 500 environment versus what maybe people imagine from the outside?
Sure. Well, I totally agree with Joe that at least in my experience with the Fortune 500 companies that I've been with, we have had calm leaders in a storm, right? And you definitely need that because that they're looking for that exudes credibility and confidence that you know what you're doing, if you will. And one of the things that I say pretty frequently is generally once you get through a storm or through an incident and to the other side, generally what you get judged on is, did you take commercially reasonable steps? So no one really necessarily expects that you're not going to get hacked. Frankly, as I say, everybody probably been hacked. But how you get judged is whether or not you took commercially reasonable steps. And I sort of keep those two words in my mind the whole time, even when we're going through an incident. Would this be seen as something reasonable that we did, right? And so the other thing I think that's very useful is, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about this, but having really clear decision makers. So who can make what kind of decision for large decisions, whether that's pay a ransom or, shut down a plant that's operating or whatever it is. Because where I have seen sort of challenges or failures is when 6 people in the room all want to make the decision themselves, and you don't have a clear sort of pecking order as to actually who gets to make the decision. I also think sometimes the big enterprises struggle to understand where the fragility is in their digital ecosystem. And I know a lot of times the incidents that we're managing nowadays, in many cases, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this as well, they're in the digital ecosystem. So they may not even be our incident, but they may be really critical to what we're doing. And in fact, what I've seen over the last 10 years is the percentage of incidents that we have actually shifted more towards being external. So you're dealing with SolarWinds, or you're dealing with an external party that impacts your operation versus being internal. And I think that also adds to the complexity. And the final thing I would say here is, and for legal privacy, that group, at least being in the healthcare space, boy, there's a lot of people that have to be notified. There's the Department of Insurance, there's the different states, there's the different countries, there's the critical customers, there's the key regulators. I mean, there's all these people, and some of them have pretty strict notification rules. And the complexity of managing that ever-changing dynamic is also, I think, one of the things that you find in a large enterprise that's typically complex. And having a really strong partner to help you understand who needs to be notified by when, whether that's outside counsel, BreachRx, whoever it is, if it's having a strong partner to help with that notification and comms process, so that you're not impacting the incident response team directly, also makes a big difference.
Yeah, one follow-up question for both of you all on this. You have a team you've hired up, you've trained, and maybe you've say successfully gotten the world-class best cybersecurity team working for you. What I often hear some CISOs talk about is the challenge of when it gets outside of the cybersecurity team, when you have to involve other folks. Like if you have a great team of folks that are calm under pressure, there's the nature of these incidents being enterprise-wide and the impact. I think, James, you talked about some of the other stakeholders essentially involved too. Can you just touch on for a little bit about that aspect of the challenge of when it gets beyond the cybersecurity team and how you stay organized and following through and accountability, all those types of things? Maybe start with you, James, and finish up.
Sure. So I generally put this in sort of 4 buckets, right? The comms team, the communications team, the cyber team, of course, the legal team, which may be privacy, may be outside counsel, may be a lot of things, and kind of the DR BCP team, which doesn't always have to get involved, but sometimes has to get involved. But to your point, Andy, once the messaging starts, you really need to try to have a very clear understanding of who can communicate updates and who can't, right? Because that's how stuff spirals out of control. I know one of the things we've run into that I've talked about before is attorney-client privilege, our favorite thing, right?
Yeah.
And I've now more than once experienced not such a good experience, the judges in more than one case throwing out attorney-client privilege because we didn't control the messaging well, and the judge kind of went, so there's only 117 people on this email thread, and somehow you think that's attorney-client privilege, and he just throws it out, and then everything comes out, everything becomes discoverable. So I do think, one of the things you want to try to control, it's okay to have messaging that's outside the attorney-client privilege medium, but you want to make sure you have really clear controls around that.
Yeah, I think, James, I've seen a lot of the case law recently has just been very unkind for companies when it comes to AC privilege in the cybersecurity context. Specifically, I think just larger enterprise data-oriented incidents more widely. It's like, if you have these other tools, Slack, Teams, email, that you're doing this work that has this kind of growing number of people that get included on communication, that's one of the big challenges. But there's also this fundamental piece of the organization does need to be able to show their work and have like a factual record of here's what was done when and why. And when you have the attorney stuff mixed in without a real clear bifurcation of like, this is designed for comms and this is designed for our record, that's where a lot of this breaks down in the case law. It's like, if you really have it cleanly separated, it's a lot easier to say, hey, here's our work. This was off the record on purpose, and it's very limited in access control. And that's one of the fundamental design things we have with BreachRx. But yeah, I'll go to Joe. Your experience on this issue. I would love your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting the way you framed it. You kind of said, there's a set of communication within the security team, and then you're expanding out. I really think that we want to pull those other teams in even before the incident, so that there never is that kind of like hop from communication within the security team by itself to then start looping in legal and communications. I think the best practice is really to have communications and legal points of contact who are involved in incidents literally included on the incident response alias that the security team has. I'd love to see it that the communications team and legal team are co-located and like literally sit physically next to the incident responders as much as possible if you have an in-office organization, so that there never is that situation where you have to go from, oh, this is close-held with security to expanding out. It's much better to have that cross-functional team feel like a team before the incident starts. I do recognize that when an incident escalates, that's where it gets tricky, because what I've seen is often the case that security, legal, and communications, they handle lots of low-level incidents together. They get resolved. They all work really well together. And then you have the big incident. And all of a sudden, a different lawyer shows up, the top lawyer.
Yeah.
A different communications person shows up, the top communications person. And that's where I think the challenge often happens, because it's a group of people who haven't been through exercises together unless you've been intentional about this, who don't have trust with each other unless they've already spent time building trust. In those major incidents, you sometimes see a communications person who doesn't understand the terminology of security. What's the difference between a bug bounty program and a ransomware situation? And so many other complicated things like that those of us who are deep in the profession take for granted that everyone around us understands. And so I think the important thing is that we make sure in our prep and practice that we pull in more senior people from the different organizations.
Yeah, I've heard many talk about that phenomenon you're describing, as there's a lack of time available for whatever reason, some of these executives that may not come to a tabletop, and then are not, may not, you may have given them an opportunity. They've probably had the incident response plan in front of them before, but just, can't be bothered to kind of dig into it for competing reasons. And then, something real happens and they just have no context to really think about all the different pieces that have been really well thought out ahead of time to be well orchestrated, and feel like, oh no, this is my company. I got to make the big calls. I've got to lean in, and there's this element of like making decisions when you have no experience to base them on, working off of gut, versus, to your point, that the team that has well practiced together is on the same page. And I think the most mature organizations I've seen have that really tight relationship between legal, comms, security, all very well in sync, well practiced, versus that mentality of it's okay for everybody to be in their silo. We just throw things over the wall when something escalates to a level. That seems to really never work out well.
Yeah, and I would say that oftentimes it's an us problem, not those execs. I think early in my career, I was reluctant to go and try and pin down the COO and the CEO and the CFO and the chief revenue officer and try and get them to engage, because I would look at them and think, whoa, they're so important. They're so busy. They got to run the company. I don't want to. But once I got a little more experience, I approached them and asked them to participate in the tabletops. Once you got them engaged, and especially in 2026, given the importance of cybersecurity, with CEOs getting called to Washington on a regular basis to talk about it, I've been pleasantly surprised to find that most executives want to go through this process. They understand that to do things well in the crisis, they need to have some repetition and some relationship with the people. So it's on us to really pull them into the meeting, not wait for them to ask us if they can participate.
So I want to get a little more specific here. Most organizations, most security teams, we have SIM tools, SOAR, XDR, EDR, threat intelligence. We got playbooks you design. Yet still, even with spending a lot of money in these categories, the response still breaks down for many of these organizations. Where Joe, where do you see these breakdowns occur, and why, even in an organization that has spent a lot of money on these tools?
Well, I think that when we think about what's ahead of us, we don't institutionally or consistently do a good job of allocating resources. Like, I want to be blunt. Like, I've spent a lot of time with security leaders, and I've spent a lot of time walking the floor of the big security conferences. And the vast majority of the tools that you can buy and that we do spend our time and money building out at our companies are focused on prevention. So like at least 70% of our budgets are on prevention. And if we say that we're spending 30% of our budget on assuming that we failed and that we have to detect things, the vast majority of that 30% is around detection.
Yeah.
It's not around crisis response. And it's funny, we all say, oh, we're going to get breached sooner or later. We need to be ready for it. But then do we actually invest in it? The amount of money that gets spent in a crisis response should be thought through ahead of time and should be kind of put into the budget, not necessarily as a guaranteed spend, but as a potential spend. It's not something you should be in the moment talking to your CFO about for the first time. And so there's a large unplanned spend involved in crisis response. And most of that budget is being spent by teams outside the security organization, which is another reason why it's so important to have those conversations ahead of time. When the big significant incident response happens, like James said, there's got to be a whole bunch of interaction with regulators. That's not the security team doing that. There's going to be outside counsel that need to be pulled in. A bunch of lawyers who are working on other things are going to have to spend time on this. The communications team might have to pull in outside crisis experts. The list goes on and on in terms of the expenses. Communication to customers might have to be through specialized platforms. And then you have regulatory inquiries that you have to respond to. There might be class action litigation. Like, there are just a ton of costs that organizations should be forecasting, and that require a cross-functional discipline that can't be done over by the security team on its own. And I think if we're intentional about this and we talk about those things, then you have the CFO and the other folks saying, all right, we should actually invest a little more in this process, and maybe we should invest even more on prevention because we don't want to get to these unanticipated catastrophic level expenses.
Yeah, I think for decades, when we think about this aspect of incident response, when you get beyond the detection, as you're saying, it's been, okay, do I have this paper incident response plan? Do I have, Mandian or my forensic firm of choice on retainer? Do I have an outside law firm that I have a relationship that I want to call in? And do I have experienced people on my team that have dealt with a lot of incidents? And that's been like the grade of what it means to have a mature organization and a mature incident response program. But when it comes to like when those things actually happen, there's still this ad hoc reactionary, okay, well, it's just that because if I have the best people around, they'll just figure it out. And that there's, to your point, there's all these other cost, disruption, all these other things that end up, impacting the organization. And because it's at a crisis level, sometimes it can even be existential. There's a sense of, well, it doesn't matter what it costs. We just have to solve the problem. And so you're not talking about costs at that point. You're just giving people in to do the things. But if you have thought about what all these things and played them out, practiced them, thought about, okay, how are we going to actually operationalize this when it occurs? Just like, because everybody assumes you will face something, then why not put a business process in place that's very operationalized? And I think the best organizations come to that conclusion and say, okay, we are going to do this in an operationalized, repeatable way. Doesn't rely on purely the best of the best being available at that any given time. And that really makes a difference if you can have a technology backbone to help you do that. James, kind of transition over to you. Where do you see these, kind of organizational failures that are beyond those technical tools? I'm curious for your thoughts.
Sure. Well, I touched on one of these, which would be unclear decision makers, or where you've got, 5 people that all think they've got the authority to make decisions. So that's certainly one of the biggest ones is, that I'm going to call it the lack of governance or, not having a clear understanding of who can make big major decisions, pay a ransom, shut something down, take something offline, whatever it is. I do think another area, though, is also, and we sort of touched on it, but it's different functions or business units operating a bit in silos. In fact, I tell a story there. I'll tell a quick story. I think we have time. I'll tell a quick story that I learned a very valuable lesson. It was back in my GE days, and this was actually a table. I mean, it was a full-on drill, to test our ability to respond. And actually, it was more geared around what do we do if, like, a shooter shows up at our headquarters? That was the premise of this thing. And so I'll try to set it up quickly. So you had the incident, you had us, you had the security incident response team, you had the physical security team. We literally had the local police department engaged in this and the whole 9 yards. And so premise, guy shows up at the site. His wife works there. He thinks she's cheating on him. He wants to see all the data. He wants all this information. And he's in there with a gun and he threatens to, he's got 7 or 8 hostages and he threatens to shoot people if we don't give him access to all this information. That's the premise. And so, man, we sounded our fire alarms, and the physical security team created their, place where they're all getting together. We created our own little conference room and war room, and we were sitting there operating. Literally, the police department came in. They brought a negotiator in. They called in the whole 9 yards. And again, I'm trying to make a long story short here. basically he began to, the shooter began to threaten to shoot people because we weren't giving him access. So our security team, my team, thought, man, the last thing, we've got so much critical PHI and PII data, we need to make damn sure we shut off all the access. So what we did is we cut off all the access to any information at the GE Capital business unit I worked at. Now, what do you think the shooter did? He shot the hostages, right? And and of course it was a drill. It wasn't real, but it was a real eye opener for me because we hadn't coordinated well with the physical security team and with the police department. And had we been tighter in our coordination, had we practiced together as functional units, we would have made sure no decision like that got made by just us in the information security department. So I think that's, to me, that was an eye opener that I learned way back 25 years ago. And then the final thing I'll say is, and we've talked a lot about the communications. I think the hard part with communications is steering everyone to the same place and making clear that this person or this team is accountable for all comms, and getting your own team to not answer emails and texts and all this other stuff, because there's all this turmoil happening, and we tend to want to try to, let me try to answer this, as opposed to pointing them to someone that is actually accountable for comms. Easier said than done, but I do think that's a critical focus area.
Big organization with a very high profile situation, as soon as there was some disclosure, all the people on the team, potentially reporter,
Exactly.
And keep your information. Example, which is not the story. How people think. Yeah. Continual messages your employees know at this time versus this is what we as a team, what's the message that I see that it's what's the message.
And
keep it.
Yeah. And to me, the hardest piece, at least in my experience, has been technology. I'm just going to be blunt, right? It's the technology team. You don't want them sitting out there on a Teams channel. If we had just patched all that stuff, gosh, if we had just done this, we wouldn't have this problem. You really don't want that communication going on in the middle of an incident. Never mind that if you're not careful, it becomes discoverable, and that could hurt you. Right.
I'm saying all my litigation experiences are always listening to this kind of holier than thou views of like, nobody cares about security around here. Everybody's just freewheeling whatever, and just people, especially when they're sleep deprived and feel like people have been ignoring their advice for a long time. The like told you so stuff. It comes out, and it's really a challenge to say, hey, this discipline, and I think having a designated place where you can have free conversation versus a place that is what's meant to be on the record, again, is that bifurcation is so important. And you touched on another thing, James, there where you're, as a security org, going into some of these this kind of crisis situation of this active shooter, or somebody with an upset party coming into an organization, with threatening people's lives, and you have like your security mindset of like, okay, and I know some security leaders actually own both physical and the digital, but it's just kind of a broader point too, that until you go through some of these active exercises together, there may be a perspective that you're not getting, as a security leader, of like, okay, if you haven't had some of the operational experience, then you may not be just, okay, yeah, the security answer is I need to cut off all systems, and you need to, contain liability, and the legal folks might be saying the same thing. But then if this is going to disrupt, revenue for months, or this is going to, stop the business from being able to carry out a very critical function, there are other nuances that sometimes you can't make the perfect security and perfect legal liability choice because of, competing factors, and risk of life. And the one example you gave is obviously one that most people would say rises up there. Joe, I'm curious, from your experience, comments on this topic.
Yeah, I think it's really important to have the communication, not just structured in terms of who owns what messaging to whom, but like what platforms you're using for the communication, where the source of truth is, and how do you keep track of the evolving source of truth? Because the reality is, so often in incidents, what you thought was the ground truth shifts over the course of the first day or two. It's almost like 100% of the time, what you thought was actually going on 2 hours into an incident is not what actually was going on. Partially, it's because of that mentality that you want to have of a bias towards assuming a breach, a bias towards assuming the worst case scenario on your team. So every new fact that you uncover as you're digging in either validates a theory or trashes your theory, and so there are these. So it's really important to keep track of what you thought was the truth at each moment in time, because you're making judgment calls like, is this a material situation? Is this a situation where we have obligations by contract to customers? Is this a situation where we have obligations to regulators? And so you have the security team that's focused on just figuring out like, what's going on here? Are we bleeding? How do we stop the bleeding? And then you have other people trying to figure out, what do we communicate? When do we communicate it? And so having a centralized single place that is the source of truth, documenting by timestamp what you thought, I think is critically important, because it's not a day later that you're going to be questioned about what you thought when. It's 6 months or 3 or even 7 years later that people are going to be Monday morning quarterbacking you. And no one's going to be able to rely on personal memory as to, oh, when we made this decision at 8 a.m., we knew these facts. Nobody can remember.
Especially if it was at 3 a.m. and you hadn't slept in 3 days, like the likelihood that you're holding on to that memory is low.
Exactly. So I think what is best practice has evolved in very firmly in the direction of like, we need to have a centralized place where all the communication is, where we can sort out privilege, where the communications team can plug in and get up-to-date information, and so on down the line.
Yeah. And you raised another thing that was one of the big inspirations for me with starting BreachRx, was seeing in this kind of manual approach to incidents of this level, where you do have that dynamic changing environment of, you know something on day 1 and you know something different on day 5, day 10, 30, whatever. And you're often going down the path with, especially if you've got these kind of static manual approaches of, okay, I'm making a decision as of what I know in day 5, and then all of a sudden the world changed on day 10 when we learned something else. Sometimes you may not remember like, what were the forks that made us go down a different path 5 days ago. And so you're getting to this position of you're having to redo a lot of analysis and things about decision making on the fly. You spend more time figuring out what I should do next and less time just immediately getting into execution. And that's why I thought it was so critical to have a system that is dynamic with your with the changing environment, to say, okay, you've got an operational backbone that's looking at all potential possibilities at all times. As things change, it automatically looks at all the things and all the other decisions you made and says, okay, now all of a sudden there's 10 other things you need to do, or, oh no, maybe actually you only need to do 2 things now because of this thing you learned. And being able to really have a backbone that's as dynamic as the changing situation is, I think, so critical to incidents, and big reason of what I found and why I wanted to have built BreachRx the way we did.
Yeah, I don't think you can count on the security team members who are doing the investigation to, as they uncover, as they lift up a stone and see what's underneath it, and they document it, are they going to always remember, oh, I better re-ping legal and communications to make sure that they're now up to date on the new facts as of now? Okay, wait,
Right.
I just found 3 more things. Someone else just found something. Like you're just not going to be able to, you shouldn't expect the security team member to be having like a tally of what, oh, wait, we're 20% away from materiality for purposes of a disclosure obligation or something like that. That's just
Right.
that's not how we want this security person focused. So we need to systematically structure it so that the communications are happening.
Yeah, and when you've only got, daily or whatever kind of cadence of stand-ups with legal, if that's where you decided that's the only time we're going to talk about these issues and share this information, that real time, what needs to be changed on the fly, you can, a whole world of things can happen in 12 hours in a security incident. And if you haven't adjusted, that's a challenge. So maybe changing topics a little bit, Joe, when you look at these security teams you've built, what do you think is the biggest thing that they underestimate about the business aspects of incidents? They get focused on the technical problem they're solving and might be, world class at digging into those details. But what do you think that most security teams are not thinking about on the business side of incidents?
I believe it's easy for the security team to underestimate the importance of communication. I've having watched a lot of security incidents unfold, from the inside and from the outside. I believe that security incidents are judged more on how things were communicated than how good the security team was at their job. And that's a hard thing for a security person to swallow a little bit. It's like, it's not so much that we did a really good job of prevention and we failed, but then we did a really good job on the incident response and cleaned everything up. If you didn't communicate well, it doesn't matter. And communication is much more complicated than we think as well, for 2 different reasons. One is something James alluded to earlier, is that the number of stakeholders who need to be communicated to has just gone up over time. I remember when I moved from working in B2C companies to B2B, when I moved to Cloudflare, your large enterprise customers do not want to read in the news or hear from their own security team that you had a security incident. And so when you're communicating about a security incident, you've got to communicate to your internal employees, you got to communicate to the media, you got to communicate to your regulators, you got to communicate to your customers, you got to communicate to your board, you've got to communicate to customers of your customers. There's so many people that are impacted, and they all need a slightly different messaging and have different things that are important to them. And so you really need to have a strong communication strategy. And I think that's a big thing that the security team kind of underestimates a little bit in their focus on the incident itself.
James, what do you see boards and executives misunderstanding?
I think three things come to mind for me. One, you all just touched on, Joe just touched on, which is they underestimate the complexity associated with the communications piece, right? And so it ends up being not well practiced or whatever, or understanding that you have different commitments for time frame. The SEC wants 24 hours, this customer 72 hours, this regulator some other time. So I think one is absolutely the complexity of communications and the need to have the communications as simple as possible, which is also complicated, right? I mean, one of my favorite quotes is, if I'd had more time, I'd have written a shorter novel, which I think they attribute to Mark Twain. But, having a concise and simple communication for a complex incident is also a challenge and takes, real expertise in the communication space to do. So that's one. The other one is, there are 2 others that jump in my head. One is the time factor, right? So I don't think necessarily the executive leadership teams or boards have an understanding of how quickly, in many cases, in some of these incidents, you need to make a decision. Whether it's, ransomware, whatever it is, a lot of times it's hours or minutes sometimes. And I think that's going to get worse. I think we're going to talk a little more about AI and its impact. But we're getting to the point where we can't sit around to wait for them to have a meeting a couple of hours from now. I mean, you can't do that. And making sure they understand the critical nature of the time associated with making decisions, I think sometimes gets underestimated. And then the final one I would say is the length of time. It's still a time one, but the length of time or the amount of effort that it takes to substantiate having a clear environment. And I've seen that their expectation is, well, tomorrow we'll be back up, or in 3 days, or whatever. And what we saw, at least in my experience at Cigna, I'll even say which one it was, we saw the average, especially with a third party involved, was more like 32 days before we could get a third party, Mandiant, CrowdStrike, pick your poison, to bless that our environment was clean. So you can be down operationally for as much as 30 days or more. That was our average, right? So I think that's something else they underestimate, that it's going to be real easy to just put things back online. And that's just not the case for the most part, right? And you all did a great job of touching on what I call the security colonoscopy, right? When they come in after the fact to do the security colonoscopy, you want to make sure that communications is super pristine, because otherwise that's where you tend to get in trouble.
Yeah. So I'm summarizing what I'm hearing from both is, incident response isn't failing because attackers are too sophisticated and it's this technical, hurdle you couldn't overcome. It's around communication, coordination across all these stakeholders, keeping people on the same page. And that's really what tends to break when you're under pressure. Another point that you both have made about, communications going out, and I think from a legal perspective, there's one of the realizations I think a lot of lawyers don't fully realize till they get into the specific situation is you may have these regulatory deadlines that are 24 hours, 72, whatever they might be, and they might fully grok that as a lawyer, and you're very aware of, okay, we're going to miss regulatory deadlines. But there's these other business contexts or these contexts that could be huge, like, we need to be very into what we say, not say what's going on, because that could totally so kinds of things. You've got a big product release going. It's paired with Breach. People are not going to talk about the product feature. Wow. And there's just a nuance there. There's like business risk. Sometimes that play more statement. Take on some risk. Do this slightly later. Justifiable reason, something you need to have more certainty before you actually assert this publicly. All of those things go into the equation. It may not be book lawyer would be like, oh, we got this time, we got to do it at this moment. There's just a lot of nuance there. Understanding the full business context is a whole.
Yeah, one thing you said made me something jump up in my mind too, which is the timing of the communications. I think a lot of places also underestimate the complexity of the timing, right? And I saw this play out in a couple of different places that I've worked. Yeah. Let's say you've got to notify the SEC, and I don't know, the FBI and the Department of Insurance, right? Well, you want to be careful because they also communicate amongst, in particular, government agencies, right? And we ran into more than one situation where we had a very unhappy government agency because we had not notified them first or at the same time. In other words, they heard it from someone else before we were able to communicate with them. So there is this timing nuance, right, that you have to be careful of. And you said something that reminded me of that complexity as well.
Yeah, actually, a big focus of the earliest days of data breach litigation that I was involved in, it's like early 2000s, when we had some data breach laws in individual states, but we didn't have them in all U.S. states, and so some had. So organizations would choose, like, okay, I've had a big breach. California has the most aggressive. I'm going to make sure I get my California notices out, but I've got all these other customers' information that was also breached, but their state doesn't have a law, so I'm not required to notify, so I'm not going to. And then all of a sudden, the lawsuits come from AGs across the U.S. that said, "Hey, this is unfair and deceptive practice under Article 5 FTC that you're not notifying us too." And so that consistency and, to your point, understanding stakeholders, and maybe as an organization, you've got to set some kind of high watermarks of, like, okay, if we're going to have to notify these people at this time legally, then there's all these other groups that we don't have to notify them at this time, but we're going to. And maybe Joe talked about it earlier, customers, like if your customer hearing about it from regulatory notice versus from you, that's meaningful from a trust relationship. And I think that's super critical.
Yeah, can I jump in here on one? Yeah. I think it's a really important thing on communication and transparency that's not discussed enough, which is we tend to, inside organizations, frame it, what do we have to talk about? And, it's like legal saying we have to talk about it, this to these people. And then other teams will say, well, if you tell them, then we have to tell these other people. But I think that we should be flipping it around and looking at the companies that have chosen to be more transparent than they're required by law. And some of them have I think, proven that transparency could be the best policy. And I'll give you an example. When I got to Cloudflare, that was just the default approach of that company, and it came from the CEO. I remember on my first major incident in 2019, it happened on a Friday night, because it seems like the big incidents always happen on Friday night.
Yeah.
And so I called Matthew, my CEO, to give him the briefing. And the CEO always asks, how bad is it? And then, have you stopped the bleeding? And is everybody involved who needs to be involved? Do you need any more resources? The usual questions you'll get from the CEO. But then Matthew said, who's writing the blog post? And my reaction was, Matthew, we'll get to the blog post after we make sure that we stop the bleeding and we're doing the things we have to do. And I hung up the call with him and went back onto the bridge with the team. And a minute later, John, our CTO, joined the bridge. And I said, John, why are you joining the bridge right now? And he said, I'm here to write the blog post. The CEO had gone and told the CTO, get out of bed and go sit in on the incident. Someone's writing the blog post. And what I learned over years working at Cloudflare was this was our MO as a company, and that was the expectation of the CEO. And every time we did that, when we put out a very detailed explanation of why we had an outage, why we had an incident, what we uncovered, what we knew when, it turned out that our customers loved it, and they came to expect it. And the amazing thing was, we could have a really bad incident where we took down 20% of the internet, and the next day the conversation would, in Hacker News or other places, would be, I trust Cloudflare more. And over and over again, I saw this commitment to transparency led to trust during the coming out of these incidents. And the reality is, if you try and have a conversation about transparency for the first time when you're in the middle of a crisis incident response, nobody's open to it. It's just like, all right, we're in a stress zone. We got to lock everything down. But if you have these conversations ahead of time, you can develop a philosophy as an organization, and your CEO can really think about it and look at how do organizations navigate crisis with trust. That's a bigger question than cybersecurity because organizations go through trust deficits all the time. And so I think part of our job as security leaders is to talk about and point out these examples of how transparency can build trust and make sure that we have these conversations before the incident.
I agree 100%. There's two other things for me. One is, especially at a company like Cloudflare, just generally, if you're offering a service to customers, you think about the security team and the operational team of that customer. And when you have an issue that impacts them, they are scrambling to figure out if you're not communicating to them, if they don't have the transparency to understand what exactly happened to you, you just know, oh, something's going on. I can't give information. That makes them look really bad for their teams and executives. Asking, hey, why is this not working? Why are things getting affected this way? And that's why I think that transparency is so appreciated in a moment like that, is because then I feel like you're a partner that's keeping them in the loop all the time. So that allows them to make their own decisions. And hopefully it doesn't mean you've lost credibility. Do that for this part because people understand it's going to respond. So the other piece I would say, and this was, I think, evolution as a lawyer, I was thinking this space was that, forever we told people don't write anything down, minimize all communication. So it's all additional liability. Only notify, absolutely have to. All these super, I'm going to protect the organization from risk. That is the main strategy to what's political privacy and data breach organizations. There's been no transparency. So frustrated that the regulators are pushing for more. That's why it's keeps dropping. Types of incidents, the incident types that now are included. It's not just about PII exposure, additional issue. And transition here into talking about AI a little bit. AI incident, chatbot goes off the rails, it's use internally. There's all of these growing enterprise digital incidents. They're all expected to be transparent. I think that's the biggest shift. Is this transparency? So yes, kind of transitioning to the next thing here, and that is talking about AI and how that's changing, not just how attacks happen, but how many things could happen at one time. Joe, how does this AI change impact the operational reality for incident response in your view?
Well, look, in 2026, we're all spending a lot of time in cybersecurity thinking about the impact of AI. And the number one thing statistically that we're seeing is that the time period between a vulnerability existing and it being exploited has just shrunk dramatically. So it used to be that if we had a vulnerability, we had a little bit of security by obscurity. And even if we found that we had the vulnerability, we still felt like, oh, we got some time to fix it. Those timeframes are just getting, like, we have to assume that every vulnerability is much more discoverable, much more quickly, and the tooling to exploit it can be put together much more quickly as well. So speed to respond has gotten more important than ever. At the same time as AI has been growing, like we have to also remember that the nature of cyber attacks that we face has changed. A decade ago, if we were doing this call, we'd just be talking about data breach. Like, we thought of security incidents as about data leaving the building, and we got to make sure that data doesn't leave the building. But in 2026, the other reality is ransomware has fundamentally changed cybersecurity defense into operational resiliency. And so the impact and cost to organizations of cyber incidents is not just data leaving the building, it's that the whole organization might grind to a halt. And so it's the combination of the speed to exploit plus the actual damage that will be done if exploitation happens. Both of those things have just gotten a lot worse in the last few years.
100%. And James, what worries you more? These AI-powered attacks or organizations trying to respond the same way they've been doing for 5
Yes, both.
years?
I have to say both. To Joe's point, we've seen not only increased speed, but increased throughput or success rate from the bad actors. And one of the other interesting things to me is, if you look statistically, and I'm making up numbers, so don't hold me to them too closely, but most of the breaches of the past, like, somewhere in the 80 to 85% space, were caused by somebody doing something silly or stupid or making a mistake or misconfiguring, or was an identity. I just talked you out of your privileged account, so I just log in, right? And we are already seeing a shift in the numbers. I think Gartner put some stuff out a few weeks ago that show that now, because it's much quicker using AI to exploit a vulnerability, where in the old days that was 10 or 15% was where we saw breaches related to vulnerability, that's increasing. So it's eating into, we're seeing less phishing and more exploitation of vulnerabilities across the environment with the capabilities that are out there. So that one thing I want to touch on, even though I would still say people are still the weakest link in the chain at the end of the day. From a team perspective, we cannot continue to operate on the, oh, yes, and I patch my mediums in 60 days and my highs in 30. And maybe if I have a 0 day, I can get it patched in a week or 72 hours. That's just not a sustainable model. And for me, where I think we're headed is you've got to get to the point where the human is not in the loop, or the human comes in the loop after an effect of change has been made in the environment. So we're going to have to get comfortable pretty soon with letting AI make a decision in real time and make a decision and make a change without having to have a human in the loop. Because as this time shrinks, we're not going to have time to get the human in the loop. And when I think about, well, what does that mean? I think one of the biggest challenges we're going to have as a technology leaders and security leaders is convincing is probably not the right word, is trying to help the ELT and the boards understand that we really don't have a choice here, that we need to get to that point where we can make automated decisions in real time. And by the way, what it's going to do is put availability, which is typically the North Star, at risk. So occasionally it's going to make a bad decision and probably shut something down it didn't need to, but we're going to have to get comfortable with that. And at least as I've been talking to the executives, some of the things that I've said that I think can help mitigate that risk a little bit, and these are basic things, but still we don't do them very well. One is asset management, really understanding who owns the apps, what apps are on what server, in what cloud environment. So asset management to the owner and keeping that dynamic and up to date can help reduce that risk, because if you do have a bump, you know where to go. I think the testing environment, almost everybody I know, peers of mine, will tell you, no, our testing environment does not match production. We may talk about how it should, but it doesn't really. And so I think really making a test environment match more closely production so that you can do an automated test quickly and feel more confident that you're not going to have a problem when you put it into production. I think that's part of it. Segmentation, I think, is another one. You can talk about segmentation, and we've been talking about that a long time. And realizing too that even in the best case scenario, we can't patch everything everywhere all the time, right? We are going to have to continue with our layered defense in depth approach and have other control layers where we can deal with things if they do happen. So I'll take a breath there.
Yeah. And part of what you guys are describing, just a couple of things that come to mind. We have a shift in cybersecurity where a very sophisticated nation state pull off of a complicated attack results in some we saw proliferation. It's ransomware to service organizations. You would have to be technical. So it's from an organization and a business that may deploy for living the world.
Yeah.
And now you think about with the vulnerability that was exposed with these models, the ability for to understand to define complicated ways to get in. I think for me, it's not just one thing. It's like, okay, you can simultaneously at the same time. Actually, the CISO, we should get talking to the CISO Fortune. Tabletop's pretty pro. 60 or something. He was saying, latest one, given we those things. He wanted to see what the team did. He said, all of it, they've been great on tabletops with one incident. As soon as the second one came in, it completely fell apart. Just you couldn't scale all these things that they did, just scale with a simple +1. And I just think about, if you talk about multiple attacks at once, how many organizations have the repeatability, the operationalized approach to handle multiple digital crises at the same time? That's really what it's going to leverage technology, in terms of your side to help you actually scale with it.
Yeah, and this isn't new, Andy. I remember calling, dealing with an incident response probably 15 years ago, and I called another company because we had seen evidence that they were compromised as well. And the immediate response I got from the CISO was, I can't even think about your Russia-focused problem that you're raising with me because I'm in the middle of dealing with a China problem. And so, that was 15 years ago. So I would submit that the issue is even bigger than that, in that it's not always just two security incidents. It might be a different type of corporate crisis that's going on at the same time as well. It might be a pricing issue or a Me Too moment, or so many different things can be happening at the same time from a communication standpoint that can complicate and cross wires.
Totally. James, we talked about this in what you're seeing in a lot of your conversations. Do you think most companies are understanding the gravity of what we're kind of seeing, this sort of tsunami of incident response that's ahead of us, or do you think it's being underestimated today?
I think it's definitely being underestimated today. I don't think they have a sense for first of all, the order of magnitude more vulnerabilities that we're going to see, right? That now have to sort of be dealt with, right? And so I think that's being underestimated. Legacy or tech debt. I don't know a single big organization that doesn't have, a pile of legacy stuff, a custom code, tech debt. And I think that's going to be another environment that we're going to have to think of ways to help reduce the risk associated with that. And again, maybe that's through some sort of segmentation. I'm sure the answer varies from one company to another, but I do think those are things where now if they can get access to that legacy environment and put one of these frontier models, Daybreak, Mythos, Tomato, however you say it, I don't think there's a good understanding of how capable these models are at even stringing together low-level vulnerabilities to create a large gap by stringing 3 or 4 of them together. So I think we're going to have to get boards and executive leadership teams comfortable that we're going to have to operate in a much stronger environment. I say that, and then I'll say out the other side of my mouth, though, still the biggest risk right now is the human in the loop. And identity and access management, right? If I can get your credentials and come in and just look like regular old traffic, that's one of the easiest ways in. And so I don't think we can lose focus, I guess, on that is what I would say, right? And the frontier models are just going to make that easier, right? And we've already seen that, right? Because they're going to go, in 5 minutes, right? Grok or Chat GPT or Claude can go and spin up a great profile on James Beeson, and you're going to have all this great information, and you're going to, it's like spearfishing just became as easy as regular old fishing, right? Because of these capabilities. And so I don't think we can lose focus on that either.
Yeah. Joe, I know you've been spending a lot of time with the frontier models. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's I think AI introduces so many interesting challenges and opportunities for us in cyber. I think that 2026 is the most exciting time that I can remember. As a person who's curious and excited about new technology, I'm enjoying 2026. Maybe also because I don't have to be responsible for, like, I don't personally have to wear the CISO hat in 2026, even though I do work with a few companies and I don't care about their security. The stress that people in the role face in 2026 is as much, if not more, than ever before, because AI introduces all these new questions. That said, I believe that, to James's point, if we can get to a place where we are introducing the right AI tooling into our defensive stack, AI can be more beneficial to us than it is for the attacker.
Well, I know we've gone through a time, flew by. Great conversation today. I really appreciate both of your time. Maybe just any last parting words here, maybe any kind of practical thoughts that reflect kind of how you're thinking about things today and where you'd advise CISOs to think about focusing their attention. I'll let James, why don't you go first?
Sure. I would say, and I think you sort of started this quote earlier, Andy, which is, no good plan survives first contact with the enemy, an old military quote, right?
Yeah.
And so practice. Tabletop exercises can make a huge difference in your ability. Joe calls it muscle memory. That's 100% right. And the best way to earn that is practice. I think you can run a lot of micro tabletops as well, maybe focused on a particular area like treasury or whatever. And that can help. So that would be one thing I would say, just in general, to work on. The other one is, get yourself familiar with these frontier models and begin to push the idea that we're going to have to get comfortable with pulling the human out of the loop to make change in our technology environments. Maybe that's not this year even, I don't know, but I think it's moving very fast. But certainly within the next 18 months, if you wait to have a human in there, you're going to get bit. So I think focusing on mitigating risk so that you can get comfortable with a model making a decision is something else that everybody needs to be focused on.
Joe?
Yeah, I would plus one to all of that and add maybe one more thing, which is it's our job as the security leader to make sure that we have enterprise alignment with the other executives on how we handle these situations well before they happen. And so it's not just the tabletops. We have to push for the cross-functional tabletops. We have to push for the tooling, but we also, as leaders, have to invest in the personal relationships with the other executives so that in those moments of crisis, we can trust each other. And you don't get there without investing well in advance.
Totally agree. Yeah, thank you both. I think the last thing I'll say is I think it's really understanding that as a security leader, you're going to be responsible for more than just security incidents, and that there are these broader types, and we touched on it very briefly at the beginning, but there's BCDR, there's all these operational impacts like a CrowdStrike situation, there's new AI-oriented things like an AI chatbot going off the rails, and that it's really important as a resilient organization that you're able to work cross-functionally across all of those incidents and having a backbone, ideally with the support of world-class agents that can All right. Thank you, everybody. If you have any questions, please follow up with us, and we'll
Thank you.